Now recording. Okay. So, I will not repeat anything I have said.
But can you go back to the BlackRock for just that statement about what they plan to do with them?
Well, I'll go back and I'll say that the Republican representative from Kentucky, Representative Barr, said in an interview that ESG principles will be one of the major focuses of a Republican majority. His quote, "My view is that ESG investing is a cancer within our capital markets. It's a fraud on American investors." Then Representative Blaine Lukenmeyer, Republican from Missouri, said he hopes to call in the heads of the big three investment advisors, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, that have used their economic power to curb climate change and advance other causes that are popular among liberals. And then former Vice President Mike Pence recently described sustainable investing as ESG political bias. So then I mentioned that, at least in the Senate, where the Democrats have a majority, the chair of the Senate Banking Committee, Sherrod Brown of Ohio, said he will continue to hold CEOs of big banks accountable for how they serve their customers, treat their employees, will bring them to Capitol Hill to answer any questions. We know, quote from Sherrod Brown, "We know that when Wall Street neglects communities of color and ignores long-term risk like climate change, its workers, small-time investors, and consumers who pay the price." So that's really fortunate that the Senate will still be in the hands of Democrats. And the fossil fuel companies have aggressively lobbied, as you know, to water down the SEC's climate disclosure rule, putting pressures on Republicans to stand up for the interest of an industry that they have championed. Senator Tom Cotton, a Republican of Arkansas, has accused BlackRock and other Wall Street firms of acting like a climate cartel and contributing to high gas prices. I don't know that correlation, but he does. Larry Fink, the chief executive of BlackRock, has defended his firm's push to hold companies accountable for environmental and social progress. And in his annual letter to corporate America this past January, he argued that focusing on ESG principles does not conflict with making money. He says, quote, "We focus on sustainability, not because we're environmentalists, but because we are capitalists and fiduciaries to our clients." Again, quoting Fink, "Capitalism has the power to shape society and to act as a powerful catalyst for change, but businesses can't do this alone, and they cannot be the climate police. Thus, you have to have the public, the private, and the nonprofit sector working together. And it's really important that nonprofit sector can't be left out." Nevertheless, BlackRock and the others do not boycott the energy industry. In Texas, we have a new law that I'm sure you're aware of that bars the state's retirement and investment funds from doing business with companies that the state comptroller says boycott oil and gas sectors. That's a Texas law. And thus, the head of BlackRock, Larry Fink, said, "We do not boycott the energy industry. In fact, they have invested $170 billion in the energy industry. And the representative Tlaib from Michigan, Democrat, pressed Diamond on whether he would commit to stop financial oil, gas, and coal projects. And he said, absolutely not. And that would be the road to hell for America. So if organizations like SHRC and ICCR don't hold BlackRock and the CEOs to the fire, the oil and gas industries will certainly be there with their checks and handouts. Now, other aspects about what the midterm election results might mean for climate action, maybe some of the positive ones, because the greener future did survive the worst of the red wave, that's for sure. But, as everyone does, Congress passed the landmark climate legislation in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act. That was major, and a major impact. The election cycle, Republican candidates said almost nothing about the Inflation Reduction Act because they are getting so much money in their districts and states from that act. So they did not in their ads, and they did not on the stump really lay into attacking this as something that should not have happened. And not only was it not a negative, and really the Inflation Reduction Act was the first major federal legislation on climate change. The many Democrats running for election, especially in Minnesota, Michigan, and Wisconsin, really ran on clean energy and climate and were very successful. The politics of climate change is shifting. The reason that most analysts I read say, the reason is jobs. It was always jobs versus the environment. Well, now with the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, the reason is jobs. Everyone is wondering how Democrats got independents and Republicans on board with clean energy. There's a pretty proven path. Once the investments have been made in the districts and jobs are beginning to be created, people are like, I see that in my community, and it becomes more popular. Less than 5% of GOP campaign spending went toward criticizing Democratic candidates' climate record. That's real progress. That's real progress. And then you have a slew of Democratic governors that have been elected. Democrats took over the governor's mansion in Maryland, where they will have the first African-American governor in the state. In Massachusetts, voters elected as their new governor Maura Healey, a woman who has been a bold foe of big oil. As Massachusetts Attorney General, she sued ExxonMobil for deceptive business practices. She won in Massachusetts by a large margin. And environment-friendly Democrats made a clean sweep in some of the industrial Midwest and Great Lakes, holding on to the governorship in Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The Michigan results were especially amazing. Governor Gretchen Whitmer, strong opponent of the controversial Line 5 oil pipeline, not only won re-election, but won re-election by a landslide. And Democrats in Michigan secured majorities in both houses of the state legislature for the first time since 1982. In Minnesota, they also now have, a Democratic governor and a Democratic House and Senate. Successful implementation of the IRA hinges in part on the ability and willingness of state governments to develop programs to take advantage of new climate law. This is why the state elections are so important, really important. State governments are especially well positioned to ensure that equity is central to the new clean energy economy. That is really an important point, that state governments are well positioned to ensure that equity is central to the new clean energy economy. And it's especially important that these climate champion wins came in the industrial heartland of America. Then you had a situation where more Republicans turned out to vote nationwide than Democrats. Republicans did a good job of getting their voters to the polls, better job than Democrats. How did Democrats do so well? Well, most of the analysts say the kids saved the day. Young voters played a major role in pushing Democrats to victory. The voters under 30 leaned heavily toward Democratic candidates. Gen Z voters cast their ballots for Democrats versus Republicans by a margin of 28%. So, President of Next Gen America, Cristina Ramirez, said, young voters helped stop the red wave and the red tsunami. She pointed to Fetterman's victory in Pennsylvania in a Senate race, which is pretty close. An estimated 70% of young voters cast their ballot for Fetterman. And in Arizona, similar margin for Mark Kelly's reelection bid and for the election of a Democratic governor, when you had people like Peter Thiel putting $15 million into the campaign of the Republican candidate and Trump. She is Trump personified. And someone said, well, there you might have Trump's vice presidential candidate, even though she was defeated, because she was a reporter for a local TV station for years and years. She's very comfortable in media and so forth. So, altogether, this next gen movement, which is a grassroots movement to register young people, not only register young people, but educate them on issues like climate change. They made contact with more than 9 million young voters across the nation, and they had an organized presence on 245 college campuses. And although young voters tend to lean, not by large margins historically, to be a little more liberal, what makes today's young voters unique is the intensity of their passion about climate change. That is the issue that really resonates with them most of all. Second, according to post-election day polls, was the issue of abortion. Young people overwhelmingly voting to assure that choice was possible. And the rise of climate voters isn't going away. Other issues may come and go, but climate change, they say, is going to stay with young people. And one of the other important things about, if you got to choose, would you rather have the House or the Senate? Take the Senate, because that means that Biden has 2 more years to appoint federal judges. and we got to get some balance in the federal judiciary. And that is important for environmental and climate progress. Since you have a stalemate with the House in one party and the Senate in another, tax hikes are going to be off the table that Biden had proposed and wanted. Defense spending is going to continue to increase. So I imagine lots of people will be buying stocks of defense industries, especially with the Russia-Ukraine war continuing, tensions with China. Although there are Republicans who say you got to cut off the blank check to Ukraine. That's kind of interesting. Most Americans favor what we're doing in Ukraine, so how that will impact the defense budget, I don't think it's going to have let's bring the defense budget down. The defense budget, again, is the defense contractors have done a beautiful job of making sure that they have decentralized their production facilities into all congressional districts in the country. So anybody that opposes cutting the defense industry is going to face a manufacturing plant or businesses or research facilities in their district, and they're going to say, you're going to cut some of the best paying jobs in our district. So they've done a beautiful job of that. And then you'll find a lot of contention over the debt limit. And Republicans are going to make a big issue out of the debt, although under President Trump, they certainly didn't worry about it. But they will, again, you'll probably have a standoff, and we'll see where that goes. But the last time Republicans shut down the government, they lost in public opinion. So we'll see how that goes. With regard to how democracy fared in the 2022 midterms, had over 100 million voters. And on a single day, and counting those votes was pretty impressive. Even though the losing candidate for governor in Arizona is crying foul, and Lindsey Graham says that there's no way Laxalt could have lost a fair election in Nevada, you don't find many folks buying the Trump line that all these elections were stolen. And I tell you, I happened to see, my daughter lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I happened to see the concession speech of Tim Ryan, who would have been a great senator, but nevertheless, we got Vance in Ohio. But he gave a concession speech in which he said, I am standing before the voters of Ohio to tell them what an honor it is to concede the election to my opponent, Mr. Vance. An honor to concede the election, because he said, that's what democracies do. We have elections, we put ourselves out, the voters decide, and we accept the results. A long time, well over a decade, U.S. Congressman from Cincinnati, Shabbat, lost his reelection bid to a Democratic city councilman. And he said, I had the honor to serve my constituents for over a decade. I value every minute of that. And we had a fair election. The votes were fairly counted, freely counted. I lost. I support my opponent taking my place in the House of Representatives. That kind of civility, you can go back and look at Al Gore's concession speech. You can look at Hillary Clinton's concession speech. And I think people are just tired of constant anger, promoting fear out of the mouths of Trump and Trump supporters. Now, the bad news is, with racial gerrymandering, it is problematic. Billionaires spent $880 million on the midterm elections. The billionaires, 735 people, represented more than 5% of election spending. And as I said, Peter Thiel put in over $15 million in the Republican candidate's race for governor in Arizona, in Laxalt's race for governor or for senator in Nevada, and he put $15 million into J.D. Vance's campaign in Ohio. Now, is it healthy for a democracy to have elected officials that owe their soul to one or two or a handful of individuals? And that all the more why you have to know the system inside out, and you have to be able to work the system, because it's harder for you to get in the door to be taken seriously than it is Peter Thiel walking in and saying, sure like you to vote this way on this piece of legislation. The U.S. government is not an investment vehicle for the ultra-wealthy. Should not be. It has become an investment vehicle for the ultimate wealthy, for the ultra-wealthy. And that is something that can only be changed legislatively. So there are some questions about the midterms that were answered, that it was more than about the economy. Everybody thought, well, with inflation, no way the Democrats are going to do well. But this is an election where, while people were deeply concerned about inflation, it wasn't the overwhelming determining factor in how people voted. 31% of the respondents, the voters, cited inflation as the main factor in their voting. Abortion, 27% of respondents. The feelings on the economy were mixed. An overwhelming majority of people said they felt the state of the economy was not so good, 76%. And, even more surprising was how voters described the impact of inflation on their families. 20% said that inflation was a severe hardship. And of those 20%, 70% went Republican, 20%, this group broke 70 to 30% for Republicans. 80% said that inflation was a moderate hardship, and Democrats won or broke even with these voters. That's the surprise. That's where inflation wasn't the determining factor. And Joe Biden's popularity rating didn't affect the election. It was not a factor in any of the Democratic candidates losing. And they, on the other hand, Donald Trump was a big drag. His candidates fared poorly. And this was interesting, despite, again, an electorate made up of more Republicans and independents than Democrats. Republicans led Democrats in their share of the national popular vote, but Trumpy candidates failed to win, did so in the context of greater Republican turnout. And you look at J.D. Vance in Ohio, he won with, I think, 52% of the vote. Mike DeWine, a popular Republican governor, and one who would be considered more towards the center. He's not a fall-in-line Trump guy, but he is quite popular. He won over 800,000 more votes than Vance. So this means that there were a lot of ticket splitters in the Republican voters, more so than the Democrats, that they simply were not ready to vote blindly for Donald Trump's candidates. Now, with regard to abortion rights, advocates in California, Kentucky, Montana, Michigan, and Vermont won measures protecting abortion rights. Only in Nebraska was there a negative vote on that issue. The quality of the candidates mattered. Oz was not a terribly quality candidate. Herschel Walker certainly isn't. We'll see whether or not those Republicans that were split ticket voters will turn out. And, you know, since it's not going to control which party has power in the Senate, there may be a drop-off in Republican voters. But they're putting tons of money, and Mitch McConnell has told Donald Trump to stay out of the state. No one tells Donald Trump to, he will do what he wants to do. Latino voters have shifted a little bit to the right in some places, especially Florida, where DeSantis got 57% of the Latino vote. Of course, in Florida, a large percentage of Latino vote is Cuban, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan. And so the Republicans do very well in that sector. Now, in South Texas, Democrats did better than what was projected. You have one kind of fajita congressional district that goes down where you had a Republican candidate winning, but Democrats won the major three Valley districts, and that was, some thought that wasn't going to happen. But the Latino voters, even though they had strongly negative views about the economy, still voted in large majorities for Democrats in Nevada, Arizona, and in Texas. And it seems as though voters did care about threats to democracy, because all of the candidates running for secretaries of state that really control elections that were Trump supporters and supported by Trump lost, except for Indiana. And so, you know, that was really positive. And I just want to mention a couple of other things. And that is really positive. South Dakota voters, in a direct democracy vote, decided to extend Medicaid coverage, which will cover 45,000 South Dakotans. And that is another Medicaid expansion ballot measure passed in a Republican state. So South Dakota is the seventh state that has put Medicaid advancement to the voters of the state. And in all seven, the voters have said, and I think all but one were Republican states, the voters said overwhelmingly, expand Medicaid. So that is very positive. And voters approved in South Dakota a constitutional amendment that would extend Medicaid eligibility under the Affordable Care Act. Anyone making less than 133% of the federal poverty level, about $18,000 for an individual, or $36,900 for a family of four, would qualify for Medicaid coverage. And 5% of South Dakotans are currently uninsured. That should take care of it. Childless adults of working age today in South Dakota, before this passed, childless adults of working age could not qualify for coverage. Pregnant women, children, and the elderly now can receive Medicaid benefits. Now, this adds to 20.4 million low-income Americans nationwide that are already insured by Medicaid. And in South Dakota, a lot of those uninsured are Native Americans. So that's going to be a tremendous boon to the health of a population that really has serious health issues. The other states where they've had direct ballots to expand Medicaid: Idaho, Maine, Missouri, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Utah. And so, when it's put to the people, direct democracy has been a path for change and a path of last resort. Now, a little problem here. When you look to date, only about half of the states allow citizen-initiated ballot measures. And of the 12 states that haven't expanded Medicaid, only 4 of them permit such initiatives, along with South Dakota, Florida, Mississippi, and Wyoming. Florida is the second largest state after Texas, and it's still refusing Medicaid expansion. And these 2 states are home to more than half of the 2.2 million people nationwide who have been left without a viable option for health care coverage because their state has not expanded Medicaid. Now, in Texas, to get a measure on the ballot, it has to go through the legislature. Texas is one of the states that does not allow citizen-sponsored ballot initiatives. Neither do Georgia and North Carolina, the biggest states after Florida not to expand Medicaid. So Texas does not allow citizen-sponsored ballot initiatives. Any ballot initiative has to come out of the legislature. And of course, we know that there are, it's a overwhelming majority of Republicans in both the House and Senate. And, of course, every state elected official in Texas has been Republican, except you have to go back to 1994 for a Democrat to have won statewide. Ohio now is totally the same as Texas. What DeSantis was saying, when he came into office, Florida was a purple state, very competitive, Democrat, Republican. Now it's solidly red. It will not be purple in the near future. And Ohio was formerly a really contentious state, now has turned red. And it is one of the worst gerrymandered states in the country. So you have, in that situation, legislators who are passing legislation that's really out of touch with the majority of voters in states. And so then let's look at what we have to be concerned about for the future. Thanks to gerrymandering, most Americans' votes for the House and Senate state level and the House and Senate on the national level won't matter. When it comes to the House of Representatives, Both 538 and the Cook Political Report says that there are only 30 to 35 competitive districts in the U.S. House of Representatives, 435 representatives, and basically you have close to 400 in safe districts. So whoever comes out of the primary is, how does your vote count if you're in opposition? That means, and this is as many as 94% of representatives running for re-election, for example, are in safe seats, 94%. So, or the candidate that comes out of the primary and is safely going to be elected. And that's obviously not healthy. Now, when it comes to the Senate, 2/3 of Americans in 2040, 2/3 of Americans will be represented by 30% of the Senate. In other words, 65 to 70% of Americans will live in a small number of states, 8 to 10 states. That means I'll have 16 to 20 senators. And 1/3 of the population will live in small populated states with overwhelming majority of white voters, older voters, and they will have 80 senators. That is not democracy. It will take a constitutional amendment to have the Senate, senators elected on a one person, one vote. Right now, in a presidential election, a voter in Wyoming, that person's vote counts 4 times what a voter in California counts. California has 40 million people, 2 senators. Wyoming, 670,000 and 2 senators. It has a smaller population than the District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. And, they don't have the right to elect senators. But, that's really frightening. And, you can look at a map of Texas. You look at every major urban city, county carried by Beto, except for Fort Worth. But all the others were carried by Beto. But the rest of the map of Texas is red. You go to Ohio, every major city carried by Ryan. The rest of the state. And I grew up in a county in rural Ohio that when I was young was 99.4% white. Today, it is, I think, 99.2% white. I mean, some of these states are becoming whiter. The diversity is all in the urban areas. And how's that diversity going to be represented? So those are the challenges and the concerns for the future. But I think the fact that Democrats did not lose what is normal in midterm elections with an unpopular president, lower than 50%. They usually lose 35 to 45 seats in the House. Didn't happen. And they managed to maintain control of the Senate. Pretty remarkable. So these are different times. The COVID, just a lot of issues. Ukraine, Russia, and a lot of issues that were not there in the past are here now. But I think we can breathe a sigh of relief, but there's so much work to be done. So the gray cells have to keep moving. No one can retire. Got to refocus and use the energy that we have to keep going. So thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Information that we don't have access to, honestly. I mean, I follow, we get all the time, right? But I learned a lot about our situation.